morning, everybody. Thank you so much, and welcome to the next installment of our Fettuccine Forum. My name is Maureen. I'm the History Programs Manager for the City of Boise Department of Arts and History. And on behalf of all my colleagues who are here tonight, thank you and welcome to the third presentation of our Fettuccine Forum series. As many of you may know, our event calendar got a little bit rearranged this season. Our February forum has been rescheduled for Thursday, April 4th. And I'll talk about that a little bit later tonight before we all wrap up. But we're all looking forward to hosting you again this coming April, one more time this season. And again, thank you all for supporting this event. We also want to take a moment to thank our many sponsors. We're very grateful to have support from the Office of the Mayor, from Boise State Public Radio, and the Department of History at Boise State University. Thank you again to our hosts here at Trailhead for allowing us to use this great venue. And if you haven't visited them already, I highly encourage you to go get some refreshments from Joe's Traveling Bar. Thank you. Yeah, cheers to them. And as I said, we're all very grateful for your support, for all these sponsorships that make the Fettuccine Forum possible. And if you're interested in learning more about all the events that we put on, you can grab, we have cultural guides all over City Hall, public libraries, all over the place throughout Boise, with information about upcoming programs and talks and events, grant opportunities, and more. All of these things are put on by the Department of Arts and History or by our grant recipients. And our website, boiseartsandhistory.org, has even more information and resources, including virtual exhibits, archival collections, and information about the Arts and History Heritage Fund. Donations to the Heritage Fund will help support and help us expand our program offerings to you. So please check out our website to learn more about that. And I want to take a moment tonight to welcome our virtual audience on Zoom. And just a reminder to all of us that tonight's event is being recorded. It will be available on our website in a few days once we get everything uploaded. And if our online audience, know that there are auto-generated captions that are available if you select live transcript at the bottom of your screen and then select show subtitles. If you're unable to attend our next event in April, just know that, again, you can visit our website, boiseartsandhistory.org, for instructions on how to participate via Zoom or to access the recording once it is uploaded. A couple of logistics. There will be a moderated question and answer session at the end of our presentation, so please hold your questions during the talk. Once again, you can write out your questions on the slips of paper you found on your chairs, and then Caitlin, our history programs assistant, will be glad to come and collect those, and we can relay them to our speaker. For those of you on Zoom, there's a Q&A feature where you can write your questions into a chat and submit them even during the talk, and we'll make sure our speaker gets those. And then finally, for our in-person audience, if you could take a moment to please silence your cell phones, that would be very much appreciated. Thank you. So let's before we get into the actual presentation, let's talk a little bit about the Fettuccine Forum overall. So over the course of the Fettuccine Forum 20th anniversary season, we have spent a lot of time really delving deep into our community and listening to stories of how Boise has transformed, expanded, diversified, and changed overall. During the last two presentations, we heard about the histories of Asian immigrants who helped build and shape Boise from its inception. We also heard about Shoshone-Bannock women who, although they have been present in the Boise Valley, for time immemorial. They were underrepresented and misunderstood in many 19th century records. And we heard a little bit about the consequences of that misunderstanding and how it reverberates into our understanding today of Shoshone-Bannock women. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the ancestral, cultural, traditional, and unceded territory of the Shoshone, Bannock, and Northern Paiute people in the Boise Valley. And all of this speaks to what we are trying to achieve with this season's Fettuccine Forum. The theme, Let's Talk About Boise, and how it's important for all of us to recognize that there has been a very long interplay of both human and environmental forces that have shaped this community for centuries. That all those forces are still at work. They will influence our common interests and the future that we envision together. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Krista Paulsen. She's an associate professor of urban studies at the School of Public Service at Boise State University. And Dr. Paulsen received her Ph.D. in sociology from UC Santa Barbara, and her research examines processes of change and stability in cities and neighborhoods, emphasizing the roles of culture, economy, and the environment. Housing has been a major issue in Boise, as I'm sure we are all aware. And in her research, Dr. Paulsen looks into neighborhood experiences and values. Tonight, we'll hear more about the relationship between housing and the notion of home in Boise and its neighborhoods, and how all those relationships connect to Boise's past and how they fit into the future. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Krista Paulsen.
Well, thanks very much for that. And thank you all for being here. This is really exciting and fun, and looking forward to the conversation. I'm really thankful for the opportunity to be part of this series and to be able to join you all here and the folks who are with us online as well. So we practiced this. One moment. When in doubt, use the arrow key. All right. Fantastic. All right. So it has become really a matter of routine to describe the housing challenges that Boise is facing as a crisis. And our city is absolutely not alone in the United States or in the world in struggling to accommodate increasing demand for housing with supply that's simply just not keeping up with that demand. So we have people who are trying to obtain housing that is affordable, that is safe, that's convenient, that is comfortable, but that also does all those things that we ask our dwellings to do in terms of providing a home to us. So tonight, I'm going to really talk about two dimensions of our housing crisis. And I'm going to start with one that's probably pretty familiar to you all, and that's rooted in the facts and figures of the region's growth and the changing housing market. But then I'll spend most of the time talking about another that's really rooted in the experience of this crisis within our neighborhoods. So let's begin with the more familiar story. Right. Boise's growing, right? So Boise's growing, housing's becoming more expensive. That's no surprise. What you see here is our metropolitan area's growth from 2000 to 2022. And when we talk about the metropolitan area, we're talking about a pretty expansive version of the Treasure Valley that includes Ada, Boise, Canyon, Gem, and Owyhee counties. But what you see here is this growth from about 468,000 people in 2000 to about 810,000. And that growth can feel really challenging at times because we need our infrastructure to keep up with that growth, everything from roadways and sewers, but also we need our social infrastructure to keep up with that growth. And we need to find ways to incorporate newcomers into our communities. If we look at housing prices, there we go. We see kind of a different figure here. And I wanted to contrast these because one of the things to keep in mind as we consider the relationship between growth and our housing market is that housing markets are absolutely more complex than simply reflections of growth. So that bump that you see here is the run-up to the 2008 financial crisis and then the correction in prices that happened after that. One of the important things to realize from this figure, though, is that a lot of the increase in the median home price in Boise that we've all been feeling and experiencing is something that's really a product of about the last 10 years. So from 2012 to 2022, the median home price in our metro area, again, that expanded geographic area, went from 134,000 to 463,000, or over a threefold increase. So if we see those together, you can see it's not just growth. Housing markets are really complex. I think more concerning is thinking about rents. So we know that rents have also steeply increased. This is a much shorter period on this graph from 2017 to 2023. And what you see is a 50% increase in median rents for two-bedroom apartments, again, in the metro area. And I'm sure that many of you have heard stories of individual renters or households who've experienced maybe even steeper increases, or maybe they've lost their housing entirely because the property that they live in has been remodeled or repurposed or re-envisioned by the owner. Okay, we'll get there. Click, click. All right. And that's been one of the biggest challenges of living through this, is seeing renters, many of whom have limited financial resources or otherwise vulnerable, struggling with housing insecurity and even homelessness. So as a community, this is a lot to reckon with. We've got increasing rents, increasing housing prices, individuals and families who are losing their housing. We have this desire to incorporate newcomers into neighborhoods as a result of growth. And we've also got the need to construct more housing to accommodate those newcomers, as well as to accommodate as well as building new types of housing to do so. So as a sociologist, my focus isn't really on what drives these housing markets or what explains increases in housing costs, but how this is all felt and experienced at the neighborhood level, right? What does it feel like to live through this moment in Boise's history? Okay. So as I'll discuss in the remainder of my talk this evening, these changes reveal an important qualitative dimension to the crisis, and one that's not really easily captured in numbers or figures, but instead emerges in the conversations that we have as a community about what's good and bad in our neighborhoods, what we value about our neighborhoods, and what we fear about ways that our neighborhoods might be changing. I'll point to several Boise neighborhoods to illustrate some broad themes and patterns based on research that I've been collecting in the last couple of years. And I want to point out that this research is ongoing and evolving. Also, that the specific neighborhoods that I point to illustrate some of these patterns are just illustrative, right? And the patterns may be happening in other neighborhoods as well. And some of the research I'll present is from my own work. I do observational research and conduct interviews. I also do research with students, and some of that is folded into here as well. So my students in urban studies and community development work with me on some of this, and also I co-teach a course called Housing Opportunities for All with Vanessa Fry at Boise State. And that's really an applied lab in which we look at different dimensions of the housing crisis in partnership with nonprofits and government agencies in our region. So I'm going to focus on three broad areas. And we're going to start with this idea of familiarity and challenges to the familiar. How is it that we deal with change? I'll discuss how elements of our neighborhood's past are present with us now, and they shape our current experiences of neighborhoods. And I'll talk about some of the anxieties and concerns that emerge as folks are worried that their neighborhoods may be becoming different types of places. I'll then move on to talking about the built environment and the landscape in which that built environment is situated, and the potential of those to alter our changes in those areas to alter our experience of neighborhoods. And those are dimensions of growth that we're probably pretty familiar with as we see farms and fields become things like subdivisions. And then finally, I'll express some concerns that I've been observing about people's worries about what happens to community in this context as we start creating new kinds of housing or using existing housing in different ways. What happens to our ability to be good neighbors to one another and to organize on behalf of our communities. And before we get going, there are quite a few illustrations and images here, and I have to say that in taking some of these, even though I'm taking pictures from the street, I recognize that homes are both public and they are private. And so it can feel a little bit invasive at times when I'm doing this. And I just want to say to you all and the folks on Zoom as well, that if you see your house up here, know that you have my thanks, and I appreciate your letting me use your home to illustrate some of what I'm talking about. All right, so let's dive into our first theme here, thinking about familiarity. So all of us on some level realize that the only thing constant is change, right? And many of us forget that when we think about our neighborhoods, right? We find a neighborhood that we love that's a really good fit for us and our family, and we kind of think it can be frozen in amber, kind of like in that moment in which we found it. You know, maybe it's just the right thing for us at this moment. We kind of forget that the world is always changing and our neighborhood is going to change too. So to illustrate some tensions around change, I'm going to take us first to the north end, right? Now, this is a neighborhood that many of us are familiar with, that many folks associate with Boise's identity. Many of us have experienced things like the Hyde Park Street Fair, trick-or-treating on Harrison, maybe gone for a hike in Camel's Back Park. It's also a neighborhood that's seen as a successful example of mixing commercial uses and residential uses, also of preserving historic structures and connecting to the history not only of the neighborhood, but to the city. So in her really excellent history of the North End called The Legacy of the Grid, Susan Stacy describes Boise's incremental march north from downtown as orchards gave way to streets and house lots and then houses, and development kind of moved in a regular pattern along a predictable grid, inclusive of features like sidewalks and street trees. And typical house lots were 25 feet, but many folks bought 2 lots, right? So you'd see 50-foot lots, and this variability in the size of houses and the size of lots is still a feature of the neighborhood today. At Hyde Park, the streetcar system anchored a commercial district that's still lively today. And the scale of development in this neighborhood is really reflective of the streetcar and the pedestrian as opposed to the automobile. As you move outward to the kind of northwestern part of the North End, you see that the impact of what Stacy calls the Great Pause of 1920 to 1945. Okay. And we can still see that today, right? So growth stalled and land prices fell, and a good deal of the area remained more rural and even agricultural for several years. And you see the legacy of that in the less predictable lot sizes, less predictable orientations of houses on their lots. Stacy writes that if curbs appear, they may be straight or rolled. Sidewalks are not the rule. We also see that the regular lines of street trees are absent, although you've got amazing trees in people's yards and gardens. So those idiosyncrasies from grid to something less predictable, from the historic to an area that includes a lot of contemporary structures, all those idiosyncrasies are part of what gives the North End its character today. So I call attention to this to illustrate how echoes of prior development decisions persist within places. So like the streetcars are gone, but the scale of that development remains, right? And today, many of us make most of our trips by automobile, but because we have those sidewalks, that neighborhood is still a walkable neighborhood. So past actions and even inactions like this great pause are folded into the everyday life and experience of communities, and they shape how we move through space and experience it. So in the North End, some of the cherished elements of the familiar neighborhood were shared through a neighborhood planning process that took place in 2020. And the goal of this planning process was to create a document to reflect residents' visions and values for their neighborhood, and that would become an addendum to Blueprint Boise and guide planning and development within the neighborhood. And through the planning process, residents had an opportunity to identify elements of the neighborhood that they cherished or even loved and sought to preserve. They also identified areas where changes would be welcome, as well as concerns that they had about the way the neighborhood was changing. And I love these love notes as an engagement strategy. And from the love notes, as well as other data collection, we can learn a little bit about what North Enders value. So one thing is, as someone put it, the lumpy sidewalks. And I have to say, I walked quite a few sidewalks, and the sidewalks are actually not in too bad shape, right? But the relationship between the sidewalks and the trees was something that people pointed to. They also really love the neighborhood cats, and I could not get a cat to sit still for me. But so it goes. Also, things like porches, right, that facilitate interaction between houses and the street. That renters and households of varying income levels are welcome and able to find housing. That is something that people appreciate, but is also a concern, because people are worried that that may no longer be the case. So that the North End has one of the highest rates of renters in Boise is something I find a lot of people don't know, but about half of North Enders are renters. And as you move to some parts of the neighborhood, like down towards Fort Street, it's closer to 70%. So in a lot of North End streets, multifamily buildings are integrated into blocks of single family homes, and sometimes rentals are parts of single family homes, like you see with this basement apartment. And in surveys associated with the planning process, people expressed a lot of support and desire to preserve historic structures, as well as housing affordability. So the planning process facilitated opportunities too for people to talk about things they were concerned about. And that included everything from preservation of trees and architecture and small businesses, to worries that more bigger homes with tighter setbacks were kind of changing the look and the feel of the neighborhood. Also, the concerns that housing affordability might alter the mix of people who are able to live in the neighborhood, so that populations like students and newcomers to the US and older people and younger people who've been part of the mix may not be able to access the neighborhood any longer. So these conversations demonstrate to me the emergence of a couple of concepts that urban sociologists find helpful. And one of those is what we call place attachment. And this is an idea that came to first to community psychologists, actually, during the really widespread urban renewal of the 1950s and 60s. And it was community psychologist Mark Freed who looked at the destruction of Boston's West End, and talked to folks who had been displaced in that process, and learned that they mourned for their neighborhood much the same way that they would mourn for a person that they had lost in their life. And he realized that it is, we develop affection and connection for places very much the same way that we develop that for people, through repeated processes of predictable kind of interactions, but also through things like experiencing really important moments in our life in a particular place. And that attaches us to places and makes them meaningful. We also see evidence of what scholars of gentrification call symbolic displacement. And we know that in gentrifying areas, that's places that are becoming kind of more expensive and more upscale. Sometimes people are directly displaced, like their rent goes up and they need to move, or their building is repurposed and they're no longer able to live there. That's direct displacement. But symbolic displacement occurs when we may be stably housed and remain in place, but the neighborhood changes so dramatically around us that we start to feel out of place, right? So it might be something like the restaurant that we've always frequented is now kind of marketing itself toward a different clientele, right? Or just that the people that we see walking down the street seem really different than us. And we begin to feel out of place, even though we haven't moved, right? We're still in the same place and out of place. Now, as I've spoken to Boise residents throughout the city about changes that are happening at the neighborhood level, I've heard many people say things like, we're so lucky that we bought our house when we did, because if we were looking for a house in this neighborhood now, we could never afford to live here. We could never afford to move here. And even though they use terms like lucky and fortunate, I also hear sadness in what they're saying. And to me, that's indicative of a feeling of this symbolic displacement, this idea that, well, if we couldn't afford to be in this neighborhood now, that means people like us can't be in this neighborhood. Right. So let's pivot now to thinking about kind of the landscape and the built environment. So in the north end, we can see how the built environment starts to foster connections with place, but that happens absolutely everywhere. And the built environment can either encourage or suppress social interactions like greeting one's neighbor from the porch. But we also see that things like sidewalks create opportunities for walking and the connections that that creates. But it matters in other ways too, the built environment. Things like architectural styles and density, or the relationship between the built and the natural environment. These are part of what lend places their character and their meaning and change the experience of being in a place. So here I'm going to take us to Southwest Boise, and particularly the area of impact. So this is kind of the area that extends from Boise's city limits into unincorporated Ada County. You see it right there. So, and here we see that we've got a lot of changes in the built environment that are changing kind of the identity and the character of the place. Because for a long time, Southwest Boise was a place that was seen very rural and agricultural. You had lots of large lots and agricultural fields. It's not uncommon to see livestock, whether that's chickens or horses, large houses, large yards, fences that are post and rail or wire fences that really give it a kind of rural feeling. And that landscape is changing. On those large parcels, we're starting to see more houses, and the houses are built in ways that are really reflective of contemporary suburbs. And the fences are changing too, right? So where you had these wire fences that allow for expansive views of the landscape and the mountains beyond, now you start to see more opaque of these vinyl fences that feel much more suburban. So the landscape's changing, the associations of the landscape and the environment are changing too. And people who came to Southwest Boise thinking that they had kind of moved to the country, right, and owned a piece of a rural place are finding now that they live in a place that's much more like a suburb, right? So another illustration of symbolic displacement. Now, I'll acknowledge that this growth, it really presents a variety of trade-offs, because additional housing eases our housing crisis. It provides opportunities for would-be homeowners, but it also means things like more traffic on roads that used to be rural. It means that housing is growing much more quickly than the development of retail or services or places to gather. So all these changes impact the landmarks by which we navigate. So things like a farmhouse or a field or a canal, or even a horse in a field. those might be really important landmarks at one moment and seemingly kind of gone the next. And that creates a disorienting experience as we're surrounded by new landmarks to which we need to orient ourselves. Now, when I moved to Boise about 5 years ago, one of the places that I looked for housing was this infill neighborhood that's in the Sunset neighborhood. And when I tried to describe to one of my colleagues where I had been looking at a house, I said, well, you know, you go behind the Albertsons on 36th, and then you turn when you see some goats. And I was just like, maybe she knows these goats, and she's like, yeah, and like everybody I've talked to is like, oh yeah, we know the goats, right? They seem friendly. I don't know. I didn't get too close, right? But you know, these kinds of landmarks, they not only help us navigate through space, but they also connect us to place, right? And so when we distinguish space and place, we're kind of talking about space as the raw material and place is when we've given those spaces meaning, right? And so our landmarks give places meaning. In this case, they remind us that, you know, we have an agricultural heritage in this area. It reminds us of kind of the quirkiness of this part of town. But these landmarks can really feel tenuous in a time of rapid change. But the point is not the goats. I also want to talk to you about this really nice little infill project here, because it's a nice example of how a substantial amount of housing can be constructed in a relatively small space. It's 16 units on a piece of land that probably would have been 4 or 5 houses if you were using conventional kinds of setbacks and lot coverage patterns. And they cluster along these nice shared walkways and share alleys and so on. And this is no small thing, right? Because building more housing provides more people opportunities for homeownership. It means that we're building housing on smaller lots so that that housing is potentially more accessible. And that helps us to move away from patterns associated with what people have referred to as exclusionary zoning, where you've got exclusively single-family homes to the exclusion of multifamily projects, where often you have very large lots that invite very large houses that become very expensive and are off limits to all but a small number of would-be homeowners. But today's our day of a lot of flip sides, right? So on the other hand, density can feel really challenging at times, and we want to acknowledge that as well. Right, so having something like a very tall structure next to a single-story home might feel like an invasion of privacy, right? It also changes the amount of access that we might have to the sunshine, right? When we think about density, we also think, of course, about traffic, right? We think about parking. Those are real concerns for folks because they impact the experience of life in neighborhoods. We also want to think about environmental concerns associated with density and making sure that rainwater has places to go, making sure that we're being respectful of tree canopy and so on. But that's not to say that density and the integration of multifamily projects can't be done thoughtfully, you know, and indeed a variety of housing types have been part of Boise neighborhoods for a really long time. So the key is understanding how to integrate that density into the built environment in thoughtful kinds of ways. And we have lots of models for that in our past. All right, so the last theme I want to talk a little bit about is community and concerns that new housing or housing types or ownership models might impact our ability to form relationships and to be neighbors and to organize. And here I'm going to take us to Southeast Boise, and particularly the part of Southeast Boise that's closest to Boise State. And this is a place where residents have observed that new housing types have the potential to kind of shift the area's demographics away from families and long-term residents toward more and more students. And I'm a faculty member at Boise State. I love students. Students are awesome. Students bring a great deal of vitality and creativity to our community, and they're an important dimension of what makes Boise, Boise. We also know that student neighborhoods have some different qualities. So students are a more transient population in that they cycle through for a relatively short period of time. And this can create what scholars of gentrification have called studentification. And that's a pattern by which, because you've got those shorter tenures and tenants are coming and going more quickly, it provides investors and property owners the chance to raise rents at quicker increments, or excuse me, in greater succession. And so the aggregate rents in these neighborhoods can go up relatively quickly. We also know that these shorter tenures mean that students aren't always socialized into neighborhood behavioral norms, right? So things like how much noise is too much noise, or where it's okay to park, or where the trash should be or not be, and so on, right? And that's understandable. So in Southeast Boise, we see that some structures are being created really with the student market in mind. And so one resident that I interviewed called attention to these very large duplexes near campus. And these are structures with about 5 bedrooms a side, and sometimes the bedrooms are rented by the bedroom. And he referred to these as mini dorms. And this may be like a really optimal kind of housing solution for students. But as he shared with me, if this starts to dominate the neighborhood, is this a good housing option for families and other types of renters, right? So what happens if the neighborhood starts to be dominated by housing that's really geared to students? Will we have more students? Will students be kind of setting the tone for the neighborhood? Will this corner of the city become less desirable or less affordable for either owner-occupant households or long-term renters or families? And it might have reached some sort of tipping point after which only students will find this corner of the city to be appealing. At the same time, we see the loss of some small houses on large lots. And this is something that we see in a lot of Boise neighborhoods, a small house on a good-sized lot. And these small houses can provide people with really important homeownership opportunities because they're more affordable than larger houses. But they can also be really attractive sites for doing something else with that property. Maybe building a larger structure like one of those mini dorms that's going to fill more of the lot and create a greater return. And so one person I spoke with who has a small house on a large lot, it's not this one, said that he's always getting these kind of unsolicited mail that says, hey, would you like to sell your property? And he hasn't. But these small houses on large lots present us with other opportunities, like the construction of ADUs or accessory dwelling units. And that's a promising kind of solution as well. So by constructing accessory dwelling units, which might look like garage apartments. Sorry, I keep thinking this is like the laser pointer. Oh, it is. You just can't see it. Yeah. They can look like an apartment above a garage or a small house in the back. We can see basement ADUs that are additions. This is a great opportunity for homeowners to create space for long-term renters, or for maybe a family member who wants some independence, like an adult child or an elderly parent. Some folks develop ADUs as a way of getting some income that allows them to manage their own housing costs, right? So as property taxes and mortgage payments are higher, renting an ADU, either long-term or short-term, can be a way to be able to retain one's own housing through that extra income. But when ADUs are primarily used as short-term rentals, and some are, we can see that, again, we start to have a change in terms of the mix of folks who are in neighborhoods and the ability to create community. And there's a project that was proposed a few years ago in West Downtown that helps to kind of illustrate this. If you don't know West Downtown, it's really a small neighborhood below State Street between 16th and 19th. So some people call it part of the North End, but it's below State Street. It's one of the smallest recognized neighborhoods in Boise, and it's got historic housing, apartments, and a mix of other uses. And in 2019, a developer proposed to construct this 17-unit building on Idaho Street that would include small apartments that would exclusively be rented on a short-term basis. And residents in the area raised a number of concerns, and some of them were really predictable things like people are going to be loud, maybe there's not going to be on-site management, but they also raised concerns about the way that this short-term rental project would displace longer-term residents and thus undermine community. So as one resident testified, she said a sense of community follows from the everyday interactions that people have in the neighborhood, like seeing people you know, whether they're walking to work, to the grocery store, seeing other people's children, seeing their pets, and also from the active neighborhood organization in West Downtown. And she continued, we want residents that are able to contribute and participate in the community and help, because that's something that the community really values. And short-term visitors are kind of pulling from the neighborhood, getting all the good things from our neighborhood, but not giving anything in return. And she's got a really important point in that the short-term, Airbnb guest is not going to become a neighborhood fixture. They're not going to participate in those reciprocal norms of watching one's children or watching one's pets, and they're not going to be involved in the neighborhood association. So today, this is the project that's there, and it's actually leasing now if you're looking for a new place. And creates an opportunity to incorporate more long-term renters into the neighborhood. And, when we talk about growth and we talk about neighborhood change, that's a topic some folks are sensitive to, is what is the mix of homeowners and renters? And scholars of urban studies have often documented that homeowners sometimes have stereotypical and negative views of renters and see them as less involved in the community, and so on. But we know from research that it's actually not homeownership per se that determines whether or not people interact with their neighbors or whether they're willing to work with their neighbor on a neighborhood issue. In fact, it's the length of time that people have been living in the neighborhood that is more determinative of that. And folks who have lived there 5 years or more are more likely to be involved and to have high amounts of what we would call social capital, or those relationships at the neighborhood level that facilitate the exchange of information, reciprocity, and engender trust. When I was speaking with a Boise resident about concerns over short-term rentals, he told me about how the place next to him was going to be a short-term rental, and then the owner changed their mind and rented it long-term. And he was really relieved by that. And what he said was, I know my neighbor now. I know who she is, I know her kids, and we're kind of building a relationship. And so that's something that's definitely better about long-term renters. So to wrap up, the experience of Boise's growth and its housing crisis, it can, definitely be measured in numbers, and that's really important, but that's only part of the story. And as I hope to have conveyed this evening, we need to kind of peel that layer back to better understand how growth matters and how related changes in our housing context are experienced. Reflecting on growth and change, we should recognize the value that accrues as individuals interact with place, forming attachments to both places and to people there. Our built environment and our landscape provide important reference points that orient us both geographically and socially. And the types of housing that we create, as well as some housing market factors out of our control, those things influence who has access to our neighborhoods and for how long, and potentially whether newcomers to our community will be able to contribute to and help to maintain our communities. Anxieties regarding neighborhood change are completely understandable, and I think anyone understanding place attachment would see that. And rather than dismiss those voices, we need to instead think about creating opportunities to learn what people value in their communities, and how those elements might be retained even in this context. And finally, we should keep in mind that every cherished element of place was new at one point, right? So the orchard becomes the streetcar suburb, which becomes the historic district, right? The vacant lot becomes the apartment building, which becomes the place to which someone has their first home, right? So while these changes around us, they're probably feeling disruptive, and that's normal. They are also things that we'll be able to incorporate into our neighborhoods and our routines, and that will foster new types of connections. And hopefully the places that we create in response to the demands of this moment at some point might become the places that we could not imagine living without. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I don't want to get too much feedback. Technical difficulties today. That's what's been defining part of our presentation. Thank you so much, Dr. Paulsen, for all that great information. And I'd like to invite everyone to please send your questions, forward, or Caitlin and I will start taking those from you now. I'm just curious, by show of hands, did anybody see their home on the PowerPoint? I did.
I am intrigued.
Thank you. Okay, so our first question is, if housing availability tripled tomorrow, would jobs keep up? Could there then be a jobs crisis?
Wow, so there's a lot of contingencies in that question. So if housing availability tripled, so it sounds like the question is kind of asking, is jobs driving the demand for housing, or is housing getting out in front of jobs? I'm not an economist, and so like those nuances of market are not really my area. But one thing I think is important for us to keep in mind is that one of the ways that the experience of housing in places is changing is that where people work is changing. And so that question of would jobs keep up, I think a really important dimension of that is where would those jobs be, right? So some of the growth that we're seeing in Boise has to do with our robust economy. These people are living and working in Boise. Some of the growth that we see in Boise is people who are living in Boise and working someplace else, right? And that's a new layer of complexity that urbanists are just starting to get their heads around, is the way that remote work is impacting where growth happens and how.
Our next question is, what do you see as what do you see are viable solutions to the housing crisis? And are those solutions on the radar of decision makers?
Yeah, I think that this is one of the things that I think is really wonderful about Boise is that it's a really self-aware community and a learning community, and a community where both residents and leaders are open to ideas from a variety of kinds of places. And so the kinds of housing innovations that we're hearing being considered in Boise are really broad. And so they include things like, like creating more density along transit corridors, right? That's part of the new, one of the principles in the new zoning code. And that's something that really aligns with best practices in terms of keeping housing and transit together. But there are also things like thinking about, well, what's the role for tiny homes and tiny homes on wheels? How might we utilize accessory dwelling units to really provide some affordable housing options and make sure that these aren't simply becoming short-term rentals, right? So my perception is that, all recommendations are welcome and kind of being considered in creative ways.
Our next question, to what extent has growth and the challenges from it led to changes in values? For example, interest in openness to zoning, or maybe ideas about property ownership as a, quote, American right?
Oh, that is a super interesting question. And there, sometimes I get questions from students and I just say like, that is an empirical question, right? That we would want to research. And I think, it's a good question because I think one of the concerns about growth wherever it happens is that, will newcomers share our values? Will they cherish the things that we cherish about our community? And oftentimes people move to places when they have choices about where they can move, they move to places where they are perceiving that they do share those values. So I think that's something important to keep in mind. And also to keep in mind the opportunity that we as Boiseans have to help to socialize newcomers, right? Instead of kind of resisting newcomers, but to kind of educate folks on how we do things, but not to be rigid in that, right? And again, to recognize that people may be bringing interesting ideas and ways of doing things.
I think a good segue to that question is, how does the loneliness crisis contribute to these pains about neighborhood change?
Oh, these are fascinating questions. And they're all just such good little nuggets of research projects, right? So, it's interesting. I think that some of the housing types that we're thinking about cultivating here in Boise do have the promise to perhaps help us address things like the loneliness crisis. Like you might imagine like, an ADU and a house on the same lot sharing a yard or garden, right? Or creating things that are more like cottage courts, right? Or like the infill project that I showed you with the common walkway that facilitate opportunities for people to pass one another by and interact. Even things like having common mailboxes as opposed to individual mailboxes can create opportunities for people to come together and share an interaction, get to know their neighbors, share information about things that are happening in their neighborhoods. And hopefully those can start to kind of eat away at that loneliness issue.
Do the neighborhood changes you see today engender more opposition than normal? And how do you separate out that opposition? Is it due to things like traffic, parking, or more people?
I think it comes from first of all, when I talked about, we know that change is constant, but we somehow forget this at the neighborhood level. This is what I'm talking about, that when someone says your neighborhood's about to change, most of us are not like, whoa, yay, like, I can't wait. There's often resistance, and some of it's practical. Things like, well, if we introduce X more housing units and we don't have parking for those housing units, then those people are going to be fighting with the existing people over a scarce resource, right? Okay, that makes good sense. That's something that we can think about and address. I think sometimes it's about how a neighborhood feels, right? So, when we change over from maybe large lot zoning to smaller lots, or from single family homes to a mix of single and multifamily kinds of properties, and it may change the way that the neighborhood feels. It may change things like noise level and light level that we need to be mindful of as well. I think sometimes people are just don't want change, but I think it's really important to kind of hear these things out and try to come to a point where we can see where those anxieties are coming from and think about practical ways to respectfully address them when we can.
So I'm going to kind of blend two questions that are related to, I think, a news story that just came out about Micron's expansion. Micron will bring 3,000 plus people here to build their plant over the next 3 years. Where will they live?
Oh, that's a great question. Another empirical question. Boise is already sensitive to the need to being behind in terms of creating enough housing to meet increasing demand, and particularly housing that is more affordable, right? The market tends to be better at taking care of the top end than the middle or the most vulnerable end of folks. It's a really great question. Watch the space, I guess.
I'm also trying to blend a couple questions about downtown apartments. So the first question is, do you know if any of these expensive rental apartments that are going up in downtown Boise are already being filled? And the second question is that many of these downtown apartment spaces don't incorporate common areas. So how do you incorporate community when developing and zoning laws don't support that?
Oh, that's really interesting. I think, so first of all, the factual question about how full the apartments are, I don't know. So, but the question about common spaces is a really interesting one. And so one thing to consider is, what are the kind of common space resources surrounding a property, right? Because it's one thing to have a common space in a building. I think some of us have had experiences though of either maybe there's a community room in a subdivision, or there's a common space in an apartment building and it's empty, right? Like no one is using that space. With these downtown buildings, so many of them are proximate to the kinds of gathering spaces and what we might call kind of third spaces, things like bars and cafes and parks and so on, places that are different than home and then work, that not only would bring together people from one building, but also help those people connect to other folks within their community. So I think that's one of the advantages of the downtown developments.
What new types of housing do you support and why?
Oh, I don't know that there's one magic type of housing to support. It's really a matter of thinking about the relationship between housing and context, right? So in some kinds of contexts, things like tiny homes might be a really great option. In another, like a big multifamily, tall building might be the absolutely right kind of thing. I think for a long time in the United States, because we were so committed to building single family homes and only single family homes, that became the only option. And so by kind of diversifying the menu of housing options within a community, first of all, we allow people of different financial means to be more likely to be able to find housing. We also make sure that people at different points of what we would call the life course, right? So they're just starting out in life, or maybe they're having a family, or maybe they're retiring, that people are able to change their housing without dramatically changing their community, having to move to a whole different part of town or a whole different town in order to find that kind of housing.
We just have a few more questions.
Sure.
All right. Do you know about the home sharing, or do you know about home sharing and the new Neighborhood Works Boise Home Share Hub? I suppose you want to talk about it.
I have heard about this, and I am guessing that the questioner might be in a better position to talk about it than I am. But again, I would lump this in the category of innovations, right? Really thinking about, are there folks who have room and space in their home that they're not using? Could they utilize some income from being able to share that? In a way, this is really a way of going back to one of the ways that housing used to work more frequently, is that people with large homes often took in boarders or lodgers. And that for young single people in particular, this was an incredibly common way to find housing. And so I think it's interesting that we're creating mechanisms to kind of move back toward that.
A couple questions this evening had to do with Airbnb. So I'm going to let this one question kind of summarize it. Do you think limiting Airbnb rentals is good for Boise? Should Boise limit like other cities do?
A lot of cities are wrestling with this question right now. And I think the things to keep in mind is, first of all, having a good understanding of just how much of the housing inventory is being used by short-term rentals, what types of housing are being used by short-term rentals, and the impact that this is having on things like vacancy rates, right? So we know that Really low vacancy rates like we've experienced in Boise over the last few years are associated with increasing rents, right? Then we've recently had a lot of new multifamily projects kind of come online, and so I'm not sure how that is kind of translating into vacancy rates. But some of the studies of the impacts of short-term rentals on rental prices for long-term renters really turn on that issue of the vacancy rate, right? So if, and they sort of hypothesized that if you waved a magic wand and took all those short-term rentals and made them long-term rentals, well, you'd have a lot more rental stock, right? I think most of us recognize that it's more complex than that. Not everyone who rents a property short-term would be willing to rent it long-term, right? And not every type of unit that's being rented short-term is appropriate to rent long-term. So those are important things to think about. At the same time, you know, when I talk to folks about the impact of short-term rentals, one of the things that they're really concerned about is it's a way that the housing stock in our community is being purchased by investors who aren't local and often managed by folks who aren't local, and that feels challenging.
So two more questions. The first one is, can you elaborate more on sidewalks in some areas and none in others nearby? It seems haphazard.
It is haphazard. This is one of my favorite things. Sidewalks are one of my favorite things. I am an avid pedestrian and lover of walking. And when I reach the end of the sidewalk, sometimes it's just like, where did it go? So, you know, it's interesting. At different times, you know, in the United States, like, we can't take sidewalks for granted. Sometimes they are built by the developer. And, you know, I did a project on a neighborhood not in Boise where in the 1920s, they're building out this neighborhood and they could not stop bragging about having sidewalks. It was the biggest deal because you absolutely cannot take sidewalks for granted, right? Sidewalks do amazing things for us in terms of giving us safe places to walk, giving us places for people who have mobility challenges to move safely. Folks who may be, you know, pushing a baby carriage or a stroller, giving them a place to walk out of the street. And so when sidewalks end abruptly, we really sometimes create dangerous situations for all of those people, right? When they then have to move into the street. That said, I know some people who live in Boise neighborhoods that don't have sidewalks who are quite satisfied with this state of affairs. And I don't know if I've answered the question. Yeah, it's true. Sidewalks, they're unpredictable. But if I had to take a position on something tonight, I would take a position that I am personally.
Thank you. Well, we got one comment from our Zoom audience that's thanking everybody for the great discussion. I'm combining our last two questions kind of into one. What are we missing in our efforts to create affordable housing? And are there any resources that you recommend for residents to become better educated about our housing crisis?
Yeah, those are really great questions. So again, in terms of thinking about Boise as a really self-aware community, as a learning community, as a community in which we have a combination of resources, including a really vital nonprofit sector, including subsidized and affordable housing, like the range of resources that are available to either provide what we sometimes call capital A affordable housing, and also to help folks access and maintain what we would call naturally occurring affordable housing. Those resources are really rich, but the housing supply is not, right? There's simply not enough to go around to help the most, the neediest members of our community who are most in need of those housing resources be able to access housing that is near at hand, right? And near to work, near to school, convenient, safe, decent, and so on. It's changing all the time. right? So there's a big new project that is just wrapping up. So those are really good signs. I think in terms of educating oneself about housing in Boise, I'm a big fan of public meetings, right? And becoming engaged and involved in opportunities, whether that's at the neighborhood level. I know many neighborhood associations within Boise have had opportunities for folks to come and talk about different housing challenges and solutions. So participating in those events is really great. Compass just did an event to educate folks about housing. The city of Boise periodically has events to help folks learn more about housing. I would keep an eye out for those kinds of opportunities. Or take a class at Boise State.
I have my own question that I'd like to ask. Is there a neighborhood in Boise that you have a soft spot for?
I have so many soft spots for all of the neighborhoods. I find like they each have their charms, right? I love my neighborhood. I love other neighborhoods too. I'm not gonna play.
Thank you so much. That's
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you.